So I'm basically here presenting and sort of representing what currently happens in complaints handling. So talking about who's involved, what typically happens, what people and organisations currently describe as good practice in handling complaints. And then what I would like to hear from you this afternoon is what you would like to be done differently. And with that in mind, as I'm talking, I would like you to have these kind of questions in your mind. That first one, why complain? I mean, there's a slight inference there of what's the point. But what is the point? What is it that if you made a complaint that you would like out of that process? How should it be handled? What does a good outcome look like? We find in the complaints that come onto my organisation about interpersonal relationships and harassment in these kind of spaces, what students are looking for is really varied. And for some students, there is a very clear driver to see justice done, and they articulate that as punishment for somebody else. And we also see a huge amount of altruism. We see a lot of students talking about how they don't want someone else to go through what they went through. And we see people talking about change, but also about apology and recognising the impact on them of what they've gone through. So there's a lot of motivations in complaints. But what would a good experience look like for you? How would it feel? Because, as I said already, complaints are a clash between a system and a very personal experience. And it is really easy for the people who are trying to design the system to forget how it feels. So that is what I would like to come out in the discussion. How would different processes make you feel? And how does that feed into their design in the future? And I'd like to think about who benefits from complaints. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as well. I picked that image fairly deliberately because I would like this afternoon session to be a little bit fun. I would like it to be about using our imagination. I would like it to be about scrutinising things in a macro level with our telescope, but also in a micro level in terms of, any little piece of a process that we want to examine. And it's about standing in a slightly different position and looking at things differently. So that is what I'm hoping for myself out of today's session, is to learn from your perspective. So I should probably introduce myself properly. My name is Jo. I'm Head of Outreach and Insight for the OIA. The OIA is the sector ombudsman. So that means we run the student complaints scheme and we cover every higher education institution in England and Wales. So that's 912 institutions at the moment. Is there anyone here who is not in a university in England? Just because things are slightly different in Scotland and slightly different in Wales, but if we're all England centred, I can focus on that. Excellent. So, providers of higher education have to be members of the scheme, and that means they have to give their students access to us at the end of an internal procedure. And then it's up to the student if they want to bring a complaint onto us and have that kind of independent scrutiny. So we are independent, we're not based in a university, we're a whole separate body, we're not government. We are set up by the Higher Education Act in 2004, so we've been running for 20 years now, offering an independent review of students' complaints. The idea in setting up a scheme like ours is that we're an alternative to the courts. The court system, not very student friendly, very expensive, and any court case obviously calls on the public purse. It's time consuming and expensive. So that was the intention. And this is our vision. This is what we are all about. We are about resolving complaints for individual students, giving them assurance that something has been done properly, and if it hasn't, putting things right. But we are more than that, and my role now, although I was a complaints handler for 12, 15 years of the first part of my career at the OIA, now I'm very much in the good practice space, about pulling the learning and the themes out from individual complaints and turning that into good practice for the sector to learn from. And we can't look at employment matters. So I know a lot of PGR students will also be employed potentially as teaching undergrads or have a slightly different part student, part employee relationship, and we can look at the things that fall within your student. We actually still, having said that, the volume of undergrads complaining to us is slightly higher, and potentially, I made this report, you gave it to this person to investigate, they didn't do it properly, they weren't well trained, they didn't seem to understand what it was I was trying to tell them. And at the end of that process, you have the right to come onto the OIA. But as I already alluded to, we see a lot of students coming to us at the end of the disciplinary process, and it's easy to see why, because they've lost something. They've lost the opportunity to continue their studies, or they've lost their good name in some respect, and they feel there is something that they want to fight. I understand why it is hard to see the benefit to an individual student in pursuing this further. We recognise the time, the effort, the energy, and potentially the constant re-traumatising of going over your experience again to someone else and trying to make that case. And the remedies that we can give to those students are quite limited, I think, because we can't make it not happen, we can't undo it. So if you make a report and say, I found this threatening, I found this offensive, I found this undermining, then that is a fact. The fact is that that is how you found it. And a good complaints procedure will recognise that. It might recognise that two people in any situation will have two truths about what happened. So I think what you tend to see in those kind of spaces, even when they're well handled, is an acknowledgement from the university that you experienced this and we can see how it has made you feel. But also, it doesn't meet the threshold to be a disciplinary process for the other person. It might tell the university, do you know what, we need to do some educational work in this department. We need to raise awareness of how things are landing. We need to shift the culture. But it probably won't result in a disciplinary process. And that is frustrating. But it doesn't mean that it didn't have value, I think. And we actually hear from students who say, I felt I had to raise it, but I don't want them disciplined. I don't want them to lose their career because of me. I just don't want it to happen again, but they don't really know, therefore, what it is they're asking for. And I think there are sometimes times when a student might be extremely anxious about pursuing something, but the university has to pursue it because they are then worried about safeguarding, they are worried about their responsibilities to other students. They may know that there is a pattern, that they are just waiting for someone to give them enough to go with to make a change. So that can be quite difficult, because if you made a report and you said, I don't want something to happen, and then something does happen, you've essentially been disempowered by that process, you've been overruled and overridden in something that is deeply personal to you, so that's problematic. Support, so providers have to support both parties. They have responsibilities to look after the well-being of their employees as well as their students, and when it's between two students they have equal responsibilities to them both. And it is extremely stressful and distressing to be accused of something. It may not be as distressing as what has happened to someone, but you know, people experience distress and stress in those spaces. And I'm minded to say here that a lot of you are maybe going to be staff in the future, and you may find yourself on the opposite end of this process at some point. And you can think about how you might like that to work. I think one thing I didn't talk about is actually you're very likely to be drawn into sitting on disciplinary panels and sitting on investigatory panels, because as we've already had alluded to this morning, the burden of work on people to fix the problems that they're suffering from is pronounced in this space. There are questions, I think, about skills and expertise. So again, depending on the scale and the size of the institution you're studying at, some of them will have loads of resources to throw at this. Some of them are picking from a pool of 3 people who have any expertise to investigate this kind of area. Timeliness is an issue, particularly where we see more in sexual harassment, to be honest, but where people do make police reports and universities are very anxious, and indeed must not do anything that could interfere with a possible prosecution. All of the providers that we speak to are really keen to learn from what goes on at other providers, because they'd like to address the problems before they hit them in the face, essentially. Sexual harassment, racial harassment, bullying tend to get a bit of media interest if they go public. And that is because the general public is interested in this kind of thing, and they have a right to be, because members of the public are thinking, should I send my children to that university? Are they going to be safe? Is this a good use of my tax money? What is happening in those spaces that are forming our future leaders? People are interested, and they should be. Governments are interested. As I say, we use our evidence in feeding into policy where we can. We don't always listen, but we're good to go. And of course, you've got the regulator, which is the Office for Students, which I'll come on to, and lots of campaign groups, pressure groups, representative groups. So in saying all of that, I would just like to sit the question with you how that makes you feel about then raising a complaint, and whether it is reassuring to know that there are bodies like the OIA who are there, who are making sure within our remit that things are being done properly, or is it intimidating to think, if I raise something, look how many people could be scrutinising my experience. I mean, everyone on that slide, bar the people directly involved, won't know it's you. It'll all be anonymous, but that level of scrutiny is there. I'm going to talk very briefly about the regulatory bit of this. So we, as an ombuds scheme, as a complaint scheme, as I said, we don't have a lot of powers. We have a lot of good compliance, and the sector is generally very well engaged with what we say is good practice, and nobody likes to be the one not doing it. But we don't have particular regulatory powers. In England, that's the Office for Students is the regulator, and in Wales it's MEDA, which has only recently been set up, taking over from HEFCU, which was a funding council before. So do they have an interest in student complaints? Yes. Will they take an individual student's complaint? Not really. You can, anyone can, as a member of the public, but also as a member of staff or a student, you can make a notification to the OFS to say, I think there's a problem here at this university, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I've experienced, but they will not respond to you as an individual. They will take that and put it in their big pot of knowledge and do something with it at some point, but you don't get an individual response and you don't get an individual remedy from it. But what they can do, and have done, is set specific requirements that are actually mandatory for universities and other HE providers. And the way that they're mandatory is, if you are a provider in England who wants to be able to charge your students tuition fees that they have access to public funding for, so if you want your students to be able to use the student loan company, you have to be on the OFS register. If you want to be able to sponsor international students, you have to be on the OFS register. There are various other things. You have to be on the register. To be on the register, you have to demonstrate that you meet their regulatory conditions. And what they have done, they published July, I think, yes, after the election, is introduce a new regulatory condition that is specifically around harassment and sexual misconduct. It takes effect from the 1st of September next year. It's been a long time coming. There was hope of it being in place from this year, and they were not able to quite manage that. The thing that has already come into effect is a ban on non-disclosure agreements. So universities can no longer respond to a complaint from a student agree a settlement with you and then put in a binding condition on you that you won't tell anyone about it. They're not allowed to do it. It must not be done. So what are their new requirements that they've put in? The good news is we think they're fairly consistent with the good practice stuff we've been telling people anyway. So every provider from the 1st of September next year must have a single source of information. They did say single document at first, but lots of people pointed out that would be an enormous document that was very off-putting. So they've admitted that, you know, now that we're in the 21st century, a web page might do. But a single place where you can find everything that you need to know about how to report harassment, what harassment is defined as, where you're studying, what their expectations of behaviour is, how they will respond to reports, what they are doing to address it in their particular community. So you should start to see providers already making that available, but definitely by the 1st of September, if you can't find a single page on your website, then they're in breach. Feel free to report. Providers are required to take steps designed to protect their students from harassment and misconduct, which is really, really broad. And what the OFS have said in that space is it needs to be specific to the particular provider's community. It needs to reflect the realities of what their students have experienced, and it might be quite different if you are in an inner city university that's not campus based to being in a campus based space in the middle of the countryside, you know, depending on your interactions with different local communities, or it will be different if you have lots of students who go out on placements, or if you have a really diverse community already, or if you don't. So it is about recognising where they're at and taking steps. Protecting students from conflicts of interest and abuse of power. This has largely been reported in terms of looking at sexual harassment, and in particular lots and lots of interest in whether it is appropriate to completely ban relationships between members of staff and students. There was a point when the OFS said they were going to do that. They didn't. There was a lot of pushback around, well, what about people who are already married when there's, you know, one of them is lecturing and one of them starts a course, you know. A lot of argument around the exceptions rather than the rule. But they've not said a total ban, but they are certainly not opposed to a total ban being put in place. They have said they must be at your university a reporting process, including a process for anonymous reporting. So they have to facilitate students bringing things forward, both not anonymously and anonymously. And you have to explain as a provider what you're going to do about anything that's reported, and talk about an appeals process, and obviously talk about bringing things onto the OIA if the student so chooses. And then there is a requirement that all students are trained. And that means active bystander training, it might mean anti-racism training, it might mean consent training. There is a bit of a tendency in all the reporting and press on this to focus on sexual harassment and racist events, incidents, anti-Semitism, other kind of forms of, you know, Islamophobia. They are slightly squashed under the radar by the very heavy emphasis on sexual misconduct. But the training is, and the regulation relates to all kind of harassment. So I know some people were talking earlier about, is there training, can we get on it? If there's not training, there will be, and you should be starting to see that coming fast, and everybody is supposed to be part of this. And they must put in place support for those affected by harassment, and there is something in the regulation about, and you must resource that support. So it's quite a lot of progress, I think, in that space. But you might look at that and see some gaps. So we can have a think about what those might be.